Hey everyone, and welcome to week 10. We are going to finish reading The Sum of Us this week and talk a bit about environmental justice and policy solutions. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of externalities. And economically, these have a formal definition, but we can suffice it to say that economics is built around this idea that we're going to engage in mutually beneficial trades. Person A trades with person B, they both agree to it, and they both get something they want. The general idea of an externality is that person C is still somehow impacted by this, right? And they weren't part of that trade. And so this is actually a major, sort of unaccounted for phenomena at the root of economic policy. And you can account for it. Like formally, you can bring in this notion of externalities. You can do the math, you can work on it, etc. It's just that it's less of a Econ 101 thing, although it is usually covered in Econ 101 classes now. But it often gets left out when people start talking about, all of the benefits of mutually beneficial trade and what you can get through economic growth. And this continues a general theme of the natural environment often gets lost in economic policy frameworks. Like we talk about things as economic resources, but we don't really talk about how they continue to exist and reproduce themselves and all of that. I say we here, that's a bit general. Like obviously there are a bunch of academics that are in fact working on environmental economics. So all of this does exist out there. But sometimes it's a bit separate from what is, more mainstream economics at the moment. And then, obviously the book makes this point very well, but just political and cultural power shapes which neighborhoods are going to bear the brunt of the pollution. That's the root core of environmental justice. It usually involves racial justice because those are, in fact, the neighborhoods that are bearing the brunt of pollution today. Okay. So going back to narrative policy, which we talked about the first week we were reading this book, it comes up in this idea of the Hinwoon and stories and heroes, and like everyone wants to feel like they're the hero of their own story. So for white people to free themselves from the debt of responsibility for racism past and present would be liberating. But there isn't an established route for redemption. America hasn't had a truth and reconciliation process like other wounded societies have. Instead, it's up to individuals to decide what they need to do in order to be good people in a white supremacist society, and it's not easy. So one thing that I think did happen is that there was a certain non-trivially small subset of people who believed that the election of Barack Obama meant it was over. So I'm thinking here of like a lot of swing voters, and perhaps most dramatically like in Iowa, which had like a 20-point swing from Obama to Trump, where they were basically saying, okay, we're fine with Barack Obama, we voted for him, we're moving on, it's all good, right? Clearly it was not in fact all good. But because there's not an established route, people can make whatever route they want, whether or not we think it fully covers everything, right? And then, of course, instead of being blind to race, colorblindness makes people blind to racism, unwilling to acknowledge where its effects have shaped opportunity or to use race-conscious solutions to address it. We've talked about this a lot with things like housing, like it was race-conscious policy that set up these structures and these incentives, and you're not going to necessarily be able to undo it without race-conscious solutions, right? Okay, so I think Wendell Berry is a really interesting figure in general because he writes about things that are left out of a lot of abstract academic frameworks. So Berry says explicitly, like, my economic point of view is from ground level. It's a point of view sometimes described as agrarian. That means in ordering the economy of a household or community or nation, I would put nature first, the economies of land use second, the manufacturing economy third, and the consumer economy fourth. And note that like the financial economy or the tech economy don't even show up, right? So this is very different in terms of like where we're putting primacy. And I'm not going to do an entire thing on Wendell Berry. He's a really fascinating thinker. I encourage you to read some of his books. I really enjoyed Economics for a Renewed Commonwealth, which is a collection of his essays about economics. But it's very different than what you might otherwise be exposed to, because his point of view very much is like from his farm, and this idea of like stewardship and economics being like good stewardship of resources as opposed to an engine for growth, right? And so he also talks about like this need for community and this idea that, you know, people matter for non-economic reasons. Says, by what standard or from what point of view are we permitted to suppose that the displaced people were not needed in their original places? And this is talking about like economic displacement from communities and people needing to move for economic opportunity. So according to the industrial standard and point of view, persons are needed only when they perform a service valuable to an employer. When a machine can perform the same service, a person then is not needed. Our mobility, whether enforced or fashionable, has dismembered and scattered families and communities. Might it not be that displaced persons were needed by their families and their neighbors, not only for their economic assistance to the home place and the household, but for their love and understanding, for their help and comfort in times of trouble? So again, like Berry really has this holistic view of human beings that stands in contrast to some of what we think about and some of what we can measure and some of what we can quantify. And I think it's really good, even if you don't agree with Berry, to really like wrestle with some of his thoughts, because he is a complete thinker on this viewpoint, and he is a very different thinker than many of the thinkers you will be exposed to throughout your education. Okay, and then The Color of Law is the book I would have assigned if The Sum of Us were not around. I think The Sum of Us is more wide-ranging and a bit more approachable. It's a very good book. Color of Law is slightly more academic, but it's also an excellent book, focusing specifically on legal barriers. And here again, these are just some quotes from The Color of Law, but they're both really making this point that these were intentional policies that got us there. We're going to need, you know, some sort of equally aggressive policies in order to desegregate. And he's looking at stuff like full employment, minimum wages, transportation infrastructure. Note that actually, like right now, we are as close to a full employment policy as we've ever had. And it is, in fact, shrinking the wage gap. The biggest beneficiaries over the past year, maybe 2 full years, in terms of income, have been those that are in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. We're seeing, as a result of this, we're also seeing more people enter the labor force because of how tight the labor market is. So there have been some really interesting effects from, our short experiment in full employment. We'll see how long it continues. And obviously it's not per se a full employment policy, like there's no guarantee, but this is the longest stretch of low unemployment that we've had. And it is having, major effects on equality in the economy. So anyway, this is it's what I wanted to talk about. Got a couple of questions. As usual, we will discuss those in Slack this week. Looking forward to talking to you all about it.